Before you fall asleep tonight, let me tell you a story. Not the kind meant to scare you awake, but the kind that quietly follows you into your dreams. Welcome to Sleeping Storyteller, where true mysteries, strange encounters, and unsettling stories are told slowly, gently, in the dark. These stories are not actually true, but if true, it's just a coincidence. This story was gathered from forgotten files, late-night reports, and moments that are never fully explained. And consider this story as your bedtime. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the night do the rest. This is Sleeping Storyteller. Let the story begin. The White Plague and the Gray Hallways. Part 1. The air inside Waverly Hills Sanatorium did not belong to the lungs of the living. It was a thick and stagnant substance that tasted of limestone dust and the metallic tang of ancient blood. Elias Thorne stood at the threshold of the main entrance while the heavy wooden doors groaned on their rusted hinges. He carried only a heavy flashlight and a digital recorder that felt like a useless toy against the oppressive weight of the five-story structure. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon of the Kentucky hills, leaving the Gothic Tudor facade to loom like a skeletal giant against a bruised purple sky. Every window of the building looked down like a hollow eye socket, and Elias felt the distinct sensation of being watched by 1,000 unseen residents who had never found their way out of the corridors. He began his walk through the first floor, where the shadows seemed to have a physical density that resisted his movement. He moved his light across the peeling paint and the crumbling plaster that hung from the ceiling like strips of dead skin from a feverish patient. This place had once been a city of the sick, where the sound of coughing was the only music and the hope of recovery was a cruel joke told by the wind. Thousands had passed away within these walls during the height of the tuberculosis outbreak when the world was gripped by fear. The survivors called it the White Plague, and the sanatorium was its cathedral, built of brick and sorrow. Elias felt the temperature drop 10 degrees as he approached the base of the grand staircase. He ignored the instinct to turn back and focused on his goal, which was the 5th floor, where the air was said to be thin enough to see through the veil of time. The climb was slow and rhythmic. Each step echoed through the empty shafts of the elevator bays and the abandoned solariums where the dying used to sit in the sun, hoping the ultraviolet rays would burn the infection from their blackened lungs. On the 3rd floor, he stopped because he heard a sound that did not belong to the wind or the settling of old timber. It was a rhythmic clicking, like the sound of hard heels striking a linoleum floor. The sound was precise and professional and cold. It moved with purpose from the far end of the hallway toward him. Elias froze and aimed his beam into the darkness, but the light revealed nothing except the swirling motes of dust that danced like tiny ghosts in the air. The clicking stopped exactly 10 feet away from him. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise because it felt expectant and hungry. He could smell the sharp scent of carbolic acid and Vieja lavender, the kind of soap a nurse from the 1920s would use to scrub the scent of death from her skin. When he reached the 5th floor, the atmosphere changed entirely. The 5th floor was not like the others because it was situated directly under the roof and housed the most volatile patients and the staff quarters. It was a place of high tension and higher stakes. At the very center of the hallway stood a door with the gold leaf numbers 502. This was the epicenter of the Kentucky hauntings and the place where the legend of the shadow began. Elias pushed the door open and it swung wide without a single creak, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive for decades. The room was small and austere, containing nothing but a rusted bed frame and a single chair that sat facing the corner. The air here was not just cold, but bone-chillingly frozen, as if the room existed in a permanent winter. He set his recorder on the windowsill and spoke into the void, asking for a sign of the woman who had lost her soul in this square of concrete. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant howl of a coyote in the hills. Then the recorder needle spiked into the red zone with a violent jerk. A voice whispered from the corner of the room where the shadows were darkest and most solid. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like it was being squeezed out of a throat that had been crushed by a heavy rope. It spoke of a secret and a shame that could not be buried by time or prayer. Elias turned his flashlight toward the corner and saw a dark stain spreading across the floor. It was a viscous black fluid that looked like oil, but moved like a living thing with a mind of its own. It crawled toward his boots with a predatory grace, and as it moved, the room began to shift and warp around him. The peeling wallpaper began to mend itself in a flicker of temporal distortion that made his head spin. The rusted bed frame became covered in crisp white linens that smelled of bleach and fresh air. For a split second, Elias was no longer standing in a ruin, but in a functional hospital room in the year 1928. He saw the silhouette of a woman standing by the window. She wore a long white dress and a starched nurse cap that sat perfectly on her head. Her back was to him, and she appeared to be looking out at the hills with a longing that felt like a physical weight. When she turned, her face was a void of gray mist, where eyes and a mouth should have been. She reached out a hand that was stained with the same black fluid, and Elias felt a crushing weight on his chest, as if the air was being sucked out of his lungs by a vacuum. He realized then that the shadow in room 502 was not a ghost, but a lingering manifestation of every death that had occurred beneath it, and he was the next witness to be claimed by the architecture of the damned. Part 2. The Descent into the Death Tunnel. Elias stumbled back out of the room as the vision of the past collided with the decay of the present, creating a dizzying blur of sensory overload. The hallway was now a chaotic landscape of flickering light and shadow, where the walls seemed to breathe and pulse with a slow and heavy heartbeat. He ran toward the back of the building where the legendary death tunnel began its long and steep descent. This was a 500-foot chute that led from the sanatorium down to the railway tracks at the bottom of the hill. It was built so that the dead could be removed in secret without the other patients seeing the black hearses that arrived every night. To Elias, the tunnel looked like the throat of a great beast waiting to swallow him whole. He plunged into the darkness of the incline because the spirit of the nurse was trailing him, and her footsteps were no longer clicking but pounding like a frantic heart against the ribs of the building. The tunnel was a perfect vacuum of sound and light that felt isolated from the rest of the world. His flashlight beam struggled to penetrate the gloom as he descended the steep concrete ramp that felt slick with the condensation of 1,000 final breaths. The walls were damp with a substance that felt like sweat and tasted like salt. As he ran, he began to hear the sound of wheels on metal tracks echoing from below. It was the sound of the body gurneys being pushed by phantom hands. Dozens of them seemed to be rushing past him in the dark, carrying invisible burdens toward the waiting trains. He felt cold hands brush against his shoulders and heard the desperate gasps of those who had died gasping for a breath they could never catch in the suffocating atmosphere of the wards. The history of the building was unfolding around him, not as a story or a movie, but as a physical assault on his reality. Halfway down the tunnel, Elias tripped on a crack in the floor and fell hard. His flashlight rolled away and landed several feet below him, illuminating a figure standing at the bottom of the chute where the light of the moon could not reach. It was the nurse again, but now she was not alone in her vigil. Behind her stood the tall shadows of the men who had died in the surgery wards and the children who had perished in the basement playground. They were all connected by the black fluid that pulsed like a collective nervous system through the concrete walls. The nurse began to move toward him with a strange and disjointed gait that defied the laws of human movement. Her neck was tilted at an impossible angle as if she were still hanging from the light fixture in room 502, and her feet did not seem to touch the ground. She reached Elias and knelt beside him with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. She did not strike him or scream in his face. Instead, she leaned close to his ear and whispered a list of names that went on for what felt like hours. They were the names of the forgotten souls who had been slid down this tunnel like refuse after they had lost their battle with the plague. As she spoke, Elias felt his own identity beginning to slip away like sand through his fingers. He felt the symptoms of the White Plague manifesting in his own body with a sudden and violent intensity. His chest burned with a fire that he could not quench, and he began to cough up a dark, thick substance that stained his shirt. He realized that the sanatorium did not just want to scare him, but it wanted to incorporate him into its architecture and make him a part of its permanent collection. It needed new stories to feed the shadows, and he was the most recent offering. With a final burst of adrenaline born from pure terror, Elias grabbed his flashlight and scrambled back up the incline with his nails clawing at the concrete. He did not look back even when he heard the nurse calling his name in a voice that sounded exactly like his mother calling him home for dinner. He burst through the exit door and into the night air of the Kentucky woods, which felt like ice against his burning skin. He did not stop running until he reached his car and locked the doors. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the fifth-floor window of room 502 shining with an unnatural light. A single light was burning in the darkness of the abandoned building, and the silhouette of a woman was waving a slow and rhythmic goodbye. He drove away as fast as the engine would allow, but the cough did not stop, and the taste of carbolic acid remained on his tongue. When he reached the city lights, he looked at his hands and saw that his fingernails were stained with a black fluid that would not wash away no matter how hard he rubbed. He was no longer a visitor or a journalist, but a part of the record of Waverly Hills, and the shadow had already moved into the empty spaces of his soul. Part 3. The Inheritance of the 502. The city of Louisville felt like a foreign planet to Elias Thorne as he drove through the neon-lit streets. The hum of traffic and the distant pulse of music from the bars should have been a comfort, but they sounded like a hollow imitation of life. He reached his apartment and fumbled with his keys, while his hands shook with a palsy that he could not control. Every time he blinked, he saw the long gray corridors of Waverly Hills stretched out before him as if his eyelids were cinema screens playing a loop of his own demise. He went straight to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, but the reflection in the mirror was not the man who had entered the sanatorium 12 hours ago. His skin had a translucent quality like thin parchment, and the veins beneath his eyes were a deep, bruised purple. The black fluid under his fingernails had spread, reaching toward his knuckles in a pattern that resembled the roots of an ancient tree. He tried to sleep, but the darkness of his bedroom was no longer empty. The silence of the apartment was filled with the phantom sounds of the fifth floor. He heard the sound of a metal chair being dragged across a concrete floor directly above his head, even though he lived on the top floor. He heard the rustle of starched fabric and the faint metallic clink of medical instruments hitting a tray. When he finally drifted into a feverish slumber, he was back in room 502. This time, he was not the observer, but the patient. He felt the phantom pressure of a heavy wool blanket over his legs and the sharp sting of a needle in his arm. He looked up and saw the nurse leaning over him, but her face was no longer a mist. She was beginning to take on his features. She had his eyes and his jawline, but her expression was one of eternal exhaustion. She leaned down and whispered that the bed was ready and that the long sleep was finally coming for them both. Elias woke up screaming, with his throat raw and his chest feeling as if it had been filled with hot lead. He staggered to his kitchen and tried to drink water, but the liquid tasted of limestone and old blood. He realized then that the sanatorium had not just haunted him, but it had replaced his internal geography with its own. His lungs were no longer breathing the air of the modern world, but the recycled breath of the thousands who had died in 1928. He looked at his phone and saw dozens of missed calls from his editor, but the device felt like a relic from a civilization he no longer belonged to. He picked it up and tried to dial for help, but his fingers would only type the numbers 502 over and over again. The black fluid had now reached his wrists, and he could feel it pulsing in time with the distant heartbeat of the building on the hill. The compulsion began at midnight on the third day. It was not a voice or a command, but a magnetic pull that tugged at the center of his being. He found himself back in his car, driving toward the outskirts of the city without any conscious memory of making the decision. The road back to Waverly Hills was a blur of shadows and moonlight. As he approached the gates, the forest seemed to part for him as if the trees were bowing to a returning king. The sanatorium sat on the crest of the hill like a crown of thorns, and Elias felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The terror had been replaced by a deep and heavy inevitability. He knew that the cycle of the shadow required a body to anchor it to the earth, and he had been chosen to be the new vessel for the grief that the building could no longer contain. He walked through the main entrance, and the doors did not groan this time, but opened with a silent welcome. He did not need a flashlight because the walls themselves were glowing with a faint phosphorescence. He saw the ghosts of the patients lined up in the hallways holding their metal cups and waiting for a medicine that would never come. They did not look at him with malice, but with a terrible recognition. He was one of them now. He climbed the stairs to the fifth floor with a strength he did not know he possessed. When he reached room 502, the nurse was waiting for him in the center of the floor. She was holding a noose made of shadows, and she held it out to him like a gift. She spoke in a voice that was now clear and melodic, telling him that his journey was over and that the story of Elias Thorne would now become a part of the walls for the next generation of seekers to find. Elias stepped toward the window and looked out at the lights of the city one last time. They looked like distant stars in a galaxy he had left behind long ago. He felt the cold touch of the shadow nurse as she placed the loop around his neck, but it did not feel like a threat. It felt like a release from the burden of the living. He stepped off the chair, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the entire building pressing down on his soul. But the pain lasted only a second before it was replaced by a cold and infinite expansion. Below him in the forest, a group of local teenagers were approaching the building with cameras and flashlights, hoping to find a thrill. Elias looked down from the window of room 502 and felt a flicker of hunger. He adjusted his nurse cap and began to practice his new walk, waiting for the first one of them to reach the stairs. The shadow was no longer a visitor, and the room was no longer empty.